Hello, and welcome back. So we were talking about a couple things in regards to the creation of the charcoal drawing here. The idea of global value versus local value. So maintaining the relationships that exist between the larger areas, yet at the same time within those larger areas, start, particularly in the bag, right? Start to manipulate the subtle value changes. And those are local relationships in order to start to reveal the textural qualities, in this case, of the bag. The other thing that we were discussing was the idea of kind of the revealing the material nature of this object, right? The paper that we're drawing. The kind of implication of its, the tensions of crumpled paper, in this case, a paper bag. As I mentioned, the kind of vulnerability of it, the kind of collapsibility of it, if you will, versus the rigidness of it. And that kind of ties into, in a certain way, the way you reveal the drawing, i.e. manipulate the material. In this case, I'm using that eraser, both erasers, as a, particularly the pencil eraser, as a kind of a mark-making tool, scribbling tool, as a way to kind of get gesture back into the drawing. In terms of these parallel hatches, these kind of quick scribbling technique approaches that kind of engender, kind of the human touch, notion of the human touch. And I do it in kind of varying ways. Essentially, it's a scribble, but it's a series of these kind of rapid parallel hatches. Hatching is a kind of parallel lines, and then there's something called cross hatching, which we'll kind of deal with a little bit more in graphite. What hatching simply means these parallel marks that kind of accumulate to give a sense of value. In this case, I'm erasing it in, right? And I'll go in with here and there with a charcoal pencil and do the same thing with the hatching technique. You can't really do it with the charcoal stick because it's just too broad. The the eraser pencil works nicely though, and then that brings up the other issue, which is the add-subtract idea, right? So you're always adding material and you're always taking away, and you'll probably tend to. I'm using the charcoal pencil as a way to kind of do that parallel hatching there, right? And then just kind of gently blending it in, not being kind of obsessive about it, but just leaving some of those marks there. It's fine, Don't blend your drawing into oblivion, which students tend to do sometimes. You want to kind of, I guess you got to ask yourself why you're making a drawing, right? Why not just take a picture of it? And part of that reason is the notion of, human touch, right? We talked about that, I think, earlier on in the semester. That a drawing kind of, in a painting, but drawing certainly reveals itself in a different way than a mechanical reproduction would, right? A photograph or a video or whatever. There's a kind of a human quality to it just by the nature of the process, right? That kind of can't be duplicated digitally. I mean, it can, but there's always that... it kind of always lacks enough, as much information as a real drawing does. There's a lot more information. In other words, kind of stated that awkwardly. There's kind of more information, I think, material information in a kind of quote unquote real drawing than in a digital drawing. In so much as a digital drawing, for the most part, is trying to replicate what the actual materials do, right? So it's kind of always falling a little short in that regard. I love digital drawing, but there's a kind of a material quality to an actual drawing that digital drawing just doesn't possess. And along with that is, a sense of sometimes awkwardness or clumsiness, right? Because it's going to do things that you don't always want it to do. See the way I that little cast shadow at the end of the, underneath the back edge of the bag there. Now that's a cast shadow going off into space, but the thin little one under the bag, the edge of the bag is real sharp, but the cast shadow as it fades into the tabletop, the foreground there, just in a subtle way, I'm talking back left corner of the bag, is softer, right? So it looks like the bag is hovering above the tabletop. Those are the sorts of nuances you want to kind of really focus in on, okay? It's hard to do that, right? It's hard to kind of make it look like that bag is just floating subtly above the tabletop. And the way you do it is you kind of create a crisper edge along the edge of the bag and let that subtle little shadow fade away into the table, into the foreground. So now I'm starting to kind of just subtly reveal some more quote-unquote detail in the with the pencil eraser. Notice every move I make, I'm using that straight edge, right? You got to do that. There's got to be this kind of crispness to the edges. The pencil's just not good enough to do it on its own. And it is about edge. Those creases are a result of edge, not outline, not line, edge. There's a difference. So if you look carefully at the drawing, there's not the only kind of linear quality here is the kind of maybe stuff I'm doing with the cross-hatching, right? But that's expressive line. That's not line in service of describing, trying to describe a form. That's line in service of expressive gesture, right? And value modulation. So what tends to happen is, as I mentioned, when you start to kind of whittle away at the textural issues of in this case, the paper bag, you lose sight of the overall value relationships. And notice the top of that bag. There's nothing really that's as dark as anything on the side of the bag, right? But within the top of that bag, I might have, 50 smaller zones, 50 kind of discrete value shifts in that top of that bag. But they're all housed within a defined value set, right? There's nothing nearly as dark as the interior of the bag, for instance, or that crease that runs along the side of the bag. So as you develop as you resolve this, as you get into that detail, you got to be aware of that. Now, what I did here is I got a little tired of it, so I kind of cut some out of the video, and I kind of wiped everything away and started to restate it again. Okay, only because, well, it's a tough one, because drawings demand that. They demand this kind of sense of attention over time. So, I'm probably going into about the third hour of the drawing here, and I felt it was getting a little too figured out, and that's kind of hard to kind of quantify for you because, you're just kind of learning how to draw here. But so I kind of needed to undo and then redo, okay, to breathe life back into the drawing. It just felt a little too finished for my taste. So all I did was just, you didn't see it, but I just kind of raked some charcoal over the whole thing, kind of wiped over the whole thing with my hand, just to unify it. That's the other thing it does when you undo your drawing. You again now are kind of back at a sense of unity that is nice. So it's a balancing act. You could totally unify this thing by kind of putting charcoal on it and wiping it all the way down to nothing, right? Or erasing everything away. That's ultimate unity. But so I wouldn't want to do that, certainly. One could, but so what I did instead was just kind of nullify. That information's still there, by the way. It's kind of in my mind in a certain way. It's in the experience of the drawing. but it's kind of embedded in the materiality of the work too. So it's not as difficult to bring those, that kind of quote unquote detail work back into the drawing again. And it's floating kind of subtly underneath. So people tend to think of detail as kind of this decorative gesture, right? And students often tell me, I'm really good at detail. Well, most people are. We survive as a species because we're very good at seeing the specific, right? We're not so good at seeing the general. So seeing the forest through the trees, we're good at seeing the trees, but we don't see the forest, right? So most people are good at detail, but are you good at understanding how to engage that sense of detail, right? When to do what? That's the difficult thing, because I see a lot of student work where the students are applying detail in a kind of superficial way, right? Like, as I say, as kind of decoration. So it never really is connected to any sense of reality for that reason. Excuse me. So one of the reasons then I nullified it, right? Kind of undid what I spent time working on, is because I felt it was getting too finished looking, right? I had to kind of go back to basics again with it. This is a good lesson, in terms of creating art. You do and you undo. You add and you subtract. So obviously I'm adding and subtracting material here, but I'm also adding and then subtracting resolution, a sense of detail, in order to kind of get to a vibe I want to get to in the drawing. And that's back, I'm going to go back to, what we were talking about a little bit earlier in terms of the purpose of drawing, right? It's kind of a shared experience, and photography is too, as well. I mean, I love photography. I, kind of have practiced photography a little bit more of recent years in video than, than drawing per se, plastic arts, as they call it. Well, even photography's plastic arts, I guess you could say. Plastic arts meaning manipulation of materials, right? So you're taking a picture of something, it's all digital. Yeah, you still, still kind of, for the most part, unless you just post to Instagram or something, you're going to get it printed out, you're going to get maybe a book made, whatever, So then it becomes a kind of an actual form that doesn't exist in cyberspace somewhere. So I guess photography could be definitely considered, plastic arts. But drawing more so maybe, because you're actually moving materials. There's a plasticity, to the experience. So my point is, it's a shared experience, right? So the beauty of it is not obvious, right? It's implicit. The meaning, the purpose of the drawing is not explicit but implicit, in that it's implied, right, over time. So the reason I kind of undid it and redid it is that I wanted to kind of engender the thing with a little more time, a little more experience, right? And subtly let the thing, meaning the drawing, let that stuff emerge in a more subtle way. So I undid it, right? And then redid it. So buried in the drawing are those earlier versions, right? But they're still there. They're just kind of informed by a new layer. And that's another thing that I think that is it really kind of difficult for students to understand sometimes, is that a drawing is you're just not kind of coloring it in and then moving on to the next thing, right? You notice in this drawing I'm moving around, adding here, going over here, finishing here, undoing there, kind of seeing it as a whole piece of work. And so what happens is by the time you're done with your drawing, there's probably a really good drawing has 50 other versions buried beneath, right? It's not just like I'm going to finish this one corner and never touch it again. That's kind of ludicrous. But that's the way we're taught, right, in terms of from early age on, in terms of the notion of, coloring in a shape in a coloring book, right? And our kind of societies, our kind of cultural experiences, kind of reveals itself in that way, I think, too, particularly, in terms of social media and stuff like that. They, the things you see on, if you Google something, for instance, you see an image or you see a definition of something and you think, well, that's it, Little does one realize that, buried within that is like multitude of other definitions, right? That kind of accumulate over time to create the new definition of something, whatever you happen to be searching for, right? So the illusion is that the singular image that you see or the singular definition of something is the be and end all of that thing. And that's the detrimental aspect, I think, of the age we live in, where experience and nuance is lost because it's only the surface image, I'll use that as a kind of an overarching term, is important. Art is a little more difficult than that. It's a little more nuanced than that. So part of the lesson of this drawing, I think, is the fact, and any drawing that we do in this class, is the fact that it's an accumulated experience. Okay, so, and that's one of the hardest things for students to understand, because they'll want to kind of fill in a certain area and be done with it and move on to the next area, right? Because it's about just covering the drawing in a lateral way, right? Just kind of filling up the plane, the surface of the drawing. And I think it's more helpful to think of a drawing as a development of image in a front to back way, meaning, or a back to front way, meaning there's a development of the image in terms of the depth of it rather than the lateral nature of it. You're not just filling in space on your paper. You're progressing the drawing from the bottom up, right? From the first stage to the last stage, which is a kind of a depth issue rather than a lateral issue. So that's another reason why I would wipe it down and start over, right? Not really start over, but kind of reassess things. And also go in with those marks, right? Those scribbles to kind of create a sense of chaos to the thing, right? Undo and then redo. So, I'm going back now and getting to the point where I'm starting to kind of play around with the top surface again, right? Kind of separating those. When you look carefully at you could see it in the original image that I, was referencing when we were doing the line drawing. That surface is divided up into these really subtle geometric forms, a lot of triangular forms to create those crinkles and wrinkles. And those forms are a result of light hitting on one side of a plane, a triangular plane, and the other side of that peak or triangular plane being in shadow. And those two juxtaposed against a neutral tone, which is the overall, the overall value of a particular plane, which in this case is the top of the paper bag. So that's why I'm still using that ruler. Now see how dark that is? Too dark. So I go in and undo it. You can't get that dark on the top of that bag because it violates, or it'll nullify that sense of light hitting the top of the bag, right? So I can get that dark on the side of the bag. Obviously, I got some nice dark shadows on that side of the bag in the interior, not the top. See, I'm kind of working the triangular kind of vibe going there. You look carefully at those wrinkles. And you think about it, that bag is a geometric form, right? It's cut and glued together in such a way that it takes on the shape of a cube, right? So if you crinkle it a little bit, which I would suggest doing, and then open it back up again when you draw it, the crinkles are going to reflect the geometric nature of the form itself. It's just that, it's what happens. It's the structure of it. So, you can't hide from geometry or math in a certain way, right? It's just the way things go. So you notice, I gave you some examples too. I did a drawing where that little kind of cutout area there, I put the perforations in. I won't do it in this drawing because I didn't spend enough time on it, but you could kind of go in and just cut away with your charcoal pencil those little, but don't do that till the very end of the drawing to create that kind of perforated edge along that opening of the bag. But look at how I did that curved area. It's not a curve. It's just a series of faceted angles to create a trajectory, right? To create an implied curve. Because I'll see students do a pretty good job with this straight edge, and then they'll throw a curve in there, and it'll look way out of place. So use your straight edge for everything. And notice that cutout area, is not right smack dab in the middle, because we have that idea of foreshortening, right? So it's back a little further. I see more of this side before the cutout as opposed to the back side of the cutout, right? Because of perspective. All these things are important. So the transition between the dark background, I've overemphasized that, right? To give a sense of drama to the thing. And I'm just focusing on the bag. Now, when you do yours, you may not have that luxury. I don't know in terms of how you light it, where you set the bag, whatever. I really control the lighting quite a bit. But the transition, generally speaking, between the number 1 zone, which is background, and number 2 zone, the 5th zone, which is foreground, is about halfway the height of the paper. Okay, so where the bag is setting is in highlight, and as it goes way back in the distance, it just disappears into darkness. That's a good methodology to use to create that sense of depth. Look how I've kind of nuanced that. There's no outlines in the right-hand side where that little kind of, the right-hand opening of the bag. See the opening of the bag, the right-hand side. So I got that little dark kind of little creased area relative to the background, which is bright, right? Then I move up to the top of the bag. All of a sudden, it transitions from the bag being brighter than the background. So you got this really subtle transition along that edge. Top of bag, bright, background dark. I move around the corner or the side of the bag there to the opening. All of a sudden, that paradigm shifts. Inside a bag dark, background light. That's very difficult to navigate without outlining the darn thing. And I don't want you to outline it, okay? I haven't outlined that. It's just dark forms, edges. So on the left side there, I see that kind of cast shadow area. I'm just kind of showing that light. Just it wasn't that severe, but I'm just kind of, for drama reasons, showing that kind of, tilting that ruler there and showing a little bit of how that light's casting back into the background there and creating a cast shadow behind the bag. So always, working the edges, trying to clean them up, trying to, get them to a point where it feels right. It's an endless game of losing edges, gaining edges, losing edges, gaining edges. So not bad. I'm kind of happy with that. It has that kind of sense of resolution, but not too resolved. So undoing it kind of helped it in that regard. It still has a kind of life and vitality to it, yet there's a sense of resolution and detail to the thing as well. So, and again, it's about a 3-hour drawing, so I could have spent another 3 hours on it probably, if not more. Right? It never ends. But that's it. Well, thanks for watching if you did. Appreciate it. And let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.